The blessing of our faith that we anticipate through the season of Advent is the injustice of God. The injustice of God. The injustice of God that infuriated Jonah. The injustice of God that threw the older son, the son who stayed at home, the unprodigal son, into a sulk. The injustice of God that offends us still. Look at who's going into heaven among us. The Wall Street bankers, the warmongers, the bigots. Anyone that hears the gospel is welcome. It is that outrageous injustice we celebrate in this season appropriately by gifts. Those unpaid for symbols of excess. We don't earn a gift. It is something given. And yes, we might work extra hours to pay for all the gifts we give. But the representation of receiving the unpaid for is that drama of God's grace. The grace which means that none of us get our just deserts. God is not Santa. God does not keep track of who's naughty or nice. And yet here is the paradox. It is this divine injustice that calls from us the greater sense of everyday justice. It is the outrage of a system that excludes, marginalizes, dispossesses, impoverishes, fails to heal, fails to find peace. And so too at Christmas there is pain, and there must be lament. For all the harm done to innocents the world round, suffering at the hands of many modern-day Herods. And so I would like us to invite us to sing a song which is entirely an indulgence on my part. It's the Coventry Carol at the back of your sheets. Written in the 16th century as part of a mystery cycle, a song which remembers the death of the innocents under Herod in Bethlehem and celebrates the child who is a gift to us all. Let's stand and stretch our legs a moment to sing this song. Elaine will play the tune through for those who are unfamiliar, then we'll sing the 4 verses straight through. But Christmas makes fools of us all, God's fools, for we still side with the tinsel, the ridiculous hope in the injustice of God that keeps us rejoicing, since we see also that with us is not in the because we see that love of God that is not in plain sight. Let us be holy fools. Let us be holy fools this season. I'm going to share a short narrative poem by Carol Ann Duffy. She is the Poet Laureate in Britain at the moment. A poem about injustice, consumerism, but also about celebration and excess. Mrs. Scrooge by Carol Ann Duffy. Scrooge, door-nailed dead, his widow, Mrs. Scrooge, lived by herself in London town. It was that time of year shops were window-dressed with unsold tinsel, trinkets, toys, with chocolates, glacé fruits, and marzipan, with Barbie and with Action Man. The words Noel and season's greetings brightly mute in neon lights. Mrs. Scrooge sat googling at her desk. Catchit the cat curled at her feet, snowflakes tumbling to the ground below the window where a robin perched, pecking at seeds. Most turkeys bred for their meat are kept in windowless barns, she reads, with some containing over 20,000 birds. Turkeys are removed from their crates and hung from shackles by their legs in moving lines. Mrs. Scrooge pressed print. The coldest Christmas Eve in years saw Mrs. Scrooge at the store handing leaflets out. The shoppers staggered past, weighed down with bags or pushing trolleys crammed with breasts, legs, crowns, eggs, port, gin, sherry, whiskey, fizz and plonk, all done on credit cards. Most shook their heads at Mrs. Scrooge, irked by her cry, "Find out how turkeys really die!" Or showed her leaflet in the pockets, or shoved their leaflets in the pockets of their coats unread, or laughed and called back at her, "Ho, ho, ho!" But Mrs. Scrooge hated waste. Sorry, and I hate this. Consumerism. But Mrs. Scrooge hated waste, consumerism. She foraged in London parks for chestnuts, mushrooms, blackberries, drank tap water, used public libraries, possessed a wind-up radio. The Thames flowed on as Mrs. Scrooge proceeded home towards her rooms. Up the echoing stairs to slippers, simple supper, candles, cocoa, cat. The fire was very low indeed, not much on such a bitter night, so soon enough she went to bed. Nightcap, bed socks, Scrooge's old pyjamas, hot water bottle, Catchit's purr, and then her own soft snore. Midnight rang out from St. Paul's. She gasped awake. The twice-locked door was open wide, and all the room was filled with light and smells of tangerines and cinnamon and wine. A cheerful ghost was perched and grinning on her bed, now like a child, now like a wise old man, with silver hair and buried holly on a crown. "Good grief," said Mrs. Scrooge, "who the hell are you?" The ghost squealed with delight and clapped its hands. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," it trilled. "Now rise and walk with me." It took her by the hand, then flew her through the bedroom wall. They stood at once upon an open country road with fields on either side. "I know this place," cried Mrs. Scrooge. "I grew up here." My family kept an orchard close. They walked along the road, Mrs. Scrooge recalling every gate and every post. This is the past. It cannot come again, went on the ghost. It is the gift your soul gives to your heart. But when she looked, the face of Christmas past bent down, just like a lover stops to steal a kiss, and then her lips were soft, then salty, tasting tears, her own. And then she awoke, at home, alone. She heard a scrambling noise inside the chimney, and sat bolt upright in her bed. "Who's there?" she said. Then with a thump, a flash, a figure in a crimson Santa suit glowed in the grate as the fire had taken human shape and combined itself to a beard from smoke. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," boomed the ghost. "Now rise, come with me." Before she knew it, Mrs. Scrooge sat on a sleigh being pulled by reindeers through a starry sky, until the Arctic circle rose beneath them like a moon. They landed, skidding on ice, in a percussion of sharp hooves and jingling bells. Tears like opals fell, then froze on Mrs. Scrooge's cheek as she looked. She stood upon a continent of ice, which sparkled between the sea and sky, endless and dazzling, as though the world kept all its treasures there, a scale which balanced poetry and prayer. But then she heard a cracking, rumbling groan and saw huge icebergs carving from the floe into the sea, then further out a polar bear floating stranded on a raft of ice. "The polar ice cap is melting," said the ghost. "Can mankind save it?" "Yes, we can," said Mrs. Scrooge. "We must." "Never give up," replied the ghost. "Don't think one ordinary human life can make no difference, for it can." The North Pole vanished like a snuffed-out flame. She woke again. "Old fool," said Mrs. Scrooge to herself, "these are just dreams." She pulled up her blankets beneath her chin and lay there worrying about the large things and the small. The wall flickered with strange shadows, shifting shapes, a turkey, then a bear, then a hooded form which pointed at her silently until it swelled and stood and spoke. "I am the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Rise now and follow me." It took her in its arms like a bride and flew her through a winter wood towards a clearing and an opening grave, around which mourners stood, then put her down. "My family," said Mrs. Scrooge. "There's Bob, and there's his lovely wife. There are my grandchildren, Peter, Martha, Tiny Tim. Look, there are my dearest friends, the Fezziwigs. They're girls. Why are we here? Who died?" The spirit pointed downward to the grave. Mrs. Scrooge crept near and peeped into the hole. She saw a cardboard coffin, crayoned brightly with a name, cartooned with flowers, faces, animals, covered with poems, kisses, hearts. She turned. At once, she stood beside the ghost, inside a huge and crowded room, her friends and family piling in. In came a fiddler with music book, who started up a jig. Mrs. Scrooge, who loved a whirl, restrained herself from dancing with the ghost. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile, bearing a tray of homemade warm mince pies, saying, Mrs. Scrooge would have wanted it this way. In came the Fezziwigs girls, with babies chuckling in their arms. In came tall nephews, arm in arm with aunts. In came old comrades, with whom she'd marched in protest against every kind of harm. In they all came, aglow with life and possibility, old and young. Away they went, 20 couples all at once, gay and straight, down the middle, up and round again, the beaming fiddler trying to saw his instrument in half. There never was such a wake,
More dancing, then more music. Someone sang, several shed tears. Then mince pies, cake, mulled wine, cold beer, more wine, more beer. Then Mrs. Scrooge heard a cheer, and there was Tiny Tim up on a chair. Then there was a hush. A toast, cried Tiny Tim, to my grandmother, the best woman who ever was. She taught us all to value everything, to give ourselves to live as each day as if it were Christmas. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, dell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. It was St. Paul's again, gargling its morning bells, the room her own, the dribbling cat staring down at her from her chest. Quickly, Mrs. Scrooge showered and dressed. She flung open the window and leaned out. A clear, bright, jovial, cold and glorious day. The doorbell rang, opened wide the door, and in they poured, taking the stairs two at a time. Bob, Bob's wife, the grandchildren, the Fezziwigs, the girls, babies, partners, all shouting, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas, one and all."